Cinderella. Chapter 1: The Light Before the Storm. Long before the days of sorrow and ashes, there was a house filled with laughter. It stood at the edge of the village, framed by vast gardens that bloomed with roses, jasmine, and golden daffodils. Every evening, warm light poured from its windows like melted honey, and neighbors passing by often paused to smile at the sight. Inside lived a little girl named Ella, known to all for her gentle spirit. She would run barefoot through the gardens, chasing butterflies with giggles as light as feathers. Her mother, a woman of rare grace and wisdom, tended the gardens with her while singing songs passed down through generations. Ella's father, a merchant with kind eyes and strong hands, often returned from his travels bearing gifts, storybooks from far-off lands, dresses spun from silken threads, and, once, a silver locket that Ella wore close to her heart. Though their life was simple compared to the grandeur of the nobles, it was rich in love. One warm afternoon, as the bees hummed among the lavender, Ella sat on a swing her father had built, her legs kicking joyfully into the air. Her mother stood nearby, smiling softly, a knowing look in her eyes. "My darling," she said, "the world can be a cruel place. But remember, have courage, and be kind. That is how you will weather any storm." Ella, too young to understand the depth of those words, simply nodded and threw her arms around her mother. At that moment, her world was perfect. But the seasons were already turning, and the first winds of change had begun to blow. Chapter 2: A Mother's Last Words. The leaves had just begun to turn gold and red when Ella first noticed her mother's steps slowing. At first, it was just small things. She would pause longer in the garden, a distant look in her eyes, or rest her hand against the doorway as if steadying herself from a sudden wind. Ella didn't ask questions. She was only 9, and her heart still believed mothers could never grow weak. But one night, her mother didn't come down for supper. Ella carried a tray of warm soup upstairs, as she had seen her father do earlier that day. The door to her parents' room creaked open, and she tiptoed in. Her mother lay beneath thick blankets, her face pale and lips cracked, but her eyes brightened when she saw her daughter. "Ella," she whispered, her voice barely rising above the wind tapping the windows, "come here, my sweet girl." Ella climbed onto the bed, nestling close beside her mother. For a long moment, they sat in silence, just the sound of the fire crackling, and the occasional distant howl of a fox. Then her mother took her hand, gently pressing a silver pendant into her palm. "This was my mother's," she said. "And now it's yours. Keep it close." Ella clutched the pendant tightly, confused and frightened. "Mama, are you going to get better?" Her mother smiled, but her eyes glistened. "Some things can't be healed, my love. But I will always be with you. In every flower you plant, in every kind word you speak, you will hear my voice." Tears welled in Ella's eyes. She didn't want poetry. She wanted her mother to live. As the fire flickered low, her mother brushed a lock of hair behind Ella's ear. "Remember what I've always told you. Have courage. And be kind," Ella whispered, voice trembling. Those were the last words they exchanged. Her mother passed quietly that night, with the stars watching overhead. The house, once filled with laughter, grew quiet. Her father became a shadow of himself, distant, always traveling. Ella, young as she was, began caring for the home the way her mother used to, tending the roses with trembling hands and eyes far older than her age. But in the garden, where the wind stirred the petals just so, she could still hear a whisper. Have courage, and be kind. Chapter 3, The Arrival of Lady Tremaine. It was nearly 2 years after her mother's passing when Ella's father returned home with a peculiar gleam in his eyes. He had been away longer than usual, months, this time, and when he finally arrived, he was not alone. Behind him stood a tall woman draped in velvet and lace, with high cheekbones, eyes like sharp glass, and a smile that didn't quite reach her lips. At her side were 2 girls, Anastasia and Drizella. Ella, now almost 12, peeked shyly from behind the staircase banister. Her heart thumped with confusion and curiosity. The woman's laughter was smooth but distant. The daughters whispered among themselves, casting sideways glances at the house. Her father called her down. "This is Lady Tremaine," he said, a nervous smile tugging at his lips. "She is my new wife." Ella's heart fluttered with surprise. She forced a smile and gave a small curtsy. "Welcome." Lady Tremaine barely acknowledged it. "So this is Ella," she said, surveying the girl like one might study a painting they weren't sure they liked. Drizella and Anastasia snickered. Her father placed a hand on Ella's shoulder. "We'll be one family now," he said gently. "You'll have sisters, a mother again, things will feel right again, I promise." Ella wanted to believe him. She truly did. In the days that followed, the house changed in subtle ways. Lady Tremaine replaced the soft-colored drapes with dark ones. She ordered the family portraits removed and replaced them with gilded mirrors and heavy oil paintings. The piano was locked, and Ella no longer heard her mother's songs echo in the hallways. Drizella and Anastasia turned out to be nothing like sisters. They mocked Ella's simple dresses, made fun of her quiet ways, and often borrowed her belongings without ever returning them. Still, Ella tried. She brought them tea in the afternoons. She offered to braid their hair. She gave them her mother's books to read, hoping to find some connection. But Lady Tremaine would always intervene, her eyes narrowing with disapproval, her tone cold. "You must understand your place, child," she once told Ella. "You are not the same as my daughters. You mustn't confuse kindness with familiarity." Ella's father, distracted by his business and perhaps blinded by the hope of new happiness, didn't see what was happening. Or perhaps he chose not to. But even in her young heart, Ella felt something shifting, like a door slowly closing. She would sit by her mother's rose garden at twilight, the sky bruised with pink and gray, wondering if the warmth of her old life would ever return. And then, one winter's day, her father left for another trip. He never came back. Chapter 4, The Breaking of the House. The day the letter arrived, snowflakes were drifting quietly across the window panes. Ella was helping the gardener dust snow from the rose bushes when she saw the messenger ride up the path. He was wrapped in a dark cloak, and his expression was solemn. Lady Tremaine opened the door herself, took the sealed parchment, read it once, and said nothing. She simply turned, closed the door, and left the messenger standing in the cold. Ella stood by the stairs, clutching her apron. "Is it from father?" Lady Tremaine turned to her slowly. "Your father," she said, her voice like frost on glass, "has died on his journey. Fever. In a distant land." The words rang in Ella's ears like an echo from a dream. She stood frozen, unable to breathe. She waited for tears. Waited for Lady Tremaine to sit her down, to offer a kind word, even a touch on the shoulder. But the woman merely added, I will now manage the estate. No more was said. That night, Ella sat alone in her room, clutching her father's old traveling cloak. The scent of cedar and ink still clung to it. Her tears fell silently, soaking into the fabric, and for the first time, she realized that she was now truly alone. Over the weeks that followed, the changes came swiftly and without mercy. The servants, one by one, were dismissed. The cheerful cook who had known Ella since she was a baby was sent away. The gardener, the stable boy, even old Marta, who had taught Ella how to sew, all gone. With no one else left, the house's endless work fell upon Ella. At first, she did it willingly. She scrubbed the floors, cleaned the fireplaces, and cooked meals, believing she was only helping while they adjusted. But soon, it was expected. Her simple cotton dresses were replaced by rags. Her bedroom was taken, and she was moved to the attic, a drafty space under the roof with one small window and an old straw mattress. Why does she get to stay here? Drizella once whined, wrinkling her nose. Because charity is exhausting, Lady Tremaine replied flatly. And she must learn to be useful. They stopped calling her Ella. Instead, after a morning of sweeping ashes from the great hearth, Drizella smirked and said, You're always covered in cinders. We should just call you Cinderella. Anastasia giggled. The name stuck. And so, Cinderella began her new life, not as a daughter, not even as a stepdaughter, but as a servant in her own home. She cooked every meal, ironed every ribbon, fetched every misplaced item. She slept little, ate less, and woke each morning to the cawing of the rooster and the cold splash of water from the well. Her hands grew calloused, her back ached, and yet she never once complained. Because somewhere deep within her heart, her mother's voice still lived. Have courage, and be kind. And Cinderella, even in the ashes, still believed in the light. Chapter 5, Ashes and Mockery. Each morning, Cinderella awoke before dawn to the chill of the attic. Her straw mattress was lumpy, and the single window often frosted over with ice. She would wrap herself in her father's old cloak, worn thin but still smelling faintly of safety, and begin her day. The chores were endless. She carried buckets of water from the well until her arms ached. She scrubbed the tiled floors until her knees bruised. She beat the rugs, polished the silver, milked the cow, fed the chickens, cleaned the chimneys, mended clothes, and emptied chamber pots. If a task existed, it was hers. Meanwhile, Anastasia and Drizella slept late, spent afternoons in fitting rooms, and evenings lounging by the fireplace, chattering about court gossip and fashion. They delighted in giving Cinderella more work, dropping ribbons on purpose, spilling tea, wrinkling gowns, and demanding they be ironed again. Cinders on your face again, Anastasia laughed one day, pointing cruelly. She always looks like she fell into the fireplace, Drizella added. It suits her. Cinderella simply smiled faintly and curtsied. Would you like more tea? Even Lady Tremaine, regal and calculating, seemed to enjoy watching her suffer silently. The stepmother rarely raised her voice. Instead, her cruelty came through calm commands and subtle humiliation. This table setting is wrong. Start again. This dress has not been ironed well. Do it over. Your hair is messy. Don't embarrass the household. You are lucky to have a roof over your head, girl. Despite it all, Cinderella never retaliated. She cried only in private, late at night in the attic, where the moonlight softened the cracked beams and mice skittered through the walls. She befriended them, in fact, clever little things who kept her company in silence and shared her crumbs. She also kept the rose garden alive. Every evening, no matter how exhausted she was, she stole a few minutes to tend to the blooms her mother once loved. She whispered stories to them, watered their roots, and deadheaded their petals. That small patch of beauty remained untouched. Lady Tremaine never cared for roses. It was in the garden that she remembered who she truly was, not just a servant or a shadow, but Ella, a girl with dreams, memories, and quiet strength. She kept her mother's silver pendant hidden beneath her clothes, close to her heart, and each time she touched it, she repeated those words. Have courage, and be kind. They were the only things that were truly hers. Chapter 6, A Royal Announcement. It was a morning like any other. The sky was painted with soft lavender hues, and a hush of dew lay over the garden roses. Cinderella had just returned from feeding the chickens when she heard the rhythmic clatter of hooves on the cobblestone path outside the manor. A royal courier, dressed in brilliant blue and gold, rode into town with a trumpet slung at his side and a scroll in his hand. Behind him followed a flurry of smaller riders who stopped at every household, unrolling parchments and reading aloud. Curious, Cinderella peered from the kitchen window, her soot-smeared hands resting on the sill. She couldn't hear clearly, but moments later, a knock came at the manor's door. Lady Tremaine opened it with regal grace. The courier bowed deeply and unrolled the scroll. His voice rang clear. By order of His Majesty the King, a royal ball shall be held at the palace 3 nights hence. The prince, now of age, shall choose a bride from among the noble-born maidens of the kingdom. Every eligible young woman is invited to attend. Drizella and Anastasia shrieked in unison from the parlor. A royal ball. The prince. A bride. That means me. They raced to the door, nearly knocking over a vase in their frenzy. Drizella was already talking about her gown. Anastasia was trying to recall the prince's face from a childhood memory. Lady Tremaine smiled coolly, her eyes calculating. We must prepare at once, she said. Dresses, gloves, jewelry, everything must be perfect. Then Cinderella, still standing quietly behind them, spoke. May I go too? The room froze. Drizella snorted. Anastasia looked horrified, as though Cinderella had suggested flying to the moon. Lady Tremaine turned slowly. You? Cinderella nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. The invitation said every eligible young woman. A long silence followed. Then Lady Tremaine's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Of course, my dear. If, her voice grew silkier, you can finish all your chores, and find something suitable to wear. Cinderella blinked. I can try. If, Lady Tremaine repeated, you are truly ready in time, you may go. Anastasia and Drizella burst into laughter. Where will she even get a dress? She'll come in rags. She doesn't even own a mirror. Cinderella's cheeks flushed, but she said nothing. Deep inside her, a flicker of hope was already forming, a fragile flame. The prince, a ball, a night at the palace. Could it be real? She would finish the chores. She would find a dress. She would go. even if no one believed she belonged there, she would believe it herself. Chapter 7, Threads of Hope. The manor buzzed with excitement in the days leading to the royal ball. Seamstresses arrived, fabrics were measured, perfumes chosen, jewels polished. Drizella wanted emeralds to match her eyes, though they clashed terribly. Anastasia demanded imported lace, even if it made her sneeze. Cinderella, meanwhile, scrubbed the floors where the seamstresses stepped. She ironed her stepsisters' gowns, fetched tea during fittings, and smiled through commands barked at her from every corner of the house. But in the quiet of the attic, beneath the roof's creaky beams, she began her own secret preparations. She pulled a wooden chest from beneath her bed, the only thing of her mother's that remained untouched. Inside lay an old gown, yellowed slightly with age, but full of grace. It had once been worn to her parents' wedding anniversary, when laughter still echoed through the halls. Cinderella held the dress to the light. It shimmered faintly, like a memory. "I think," she whispered, "it can still be beautiful." But she couldn't do it alone. That evening, as the sky turned violet, she tiptoed to the kitchen and called softly. "Gus? Jack? Where are you?" Tiny rustlings answered from the walls. Two little mice, her faithful friends, peeked out from behind a cupboard. Gus was round and clumsy, always chewing something. Jack was quick and clever, with whiskers that twitched when excited. Cinderella knelt. "I need your help." With chirps and nods, they agreed. Each night after her chores, when the rest of the house slept, she and her tiny helpers worked in secret. Gus dragged thread spools twice his size. Jack stitched with needles nearly as long as his body. Birds from the garden brought bits of ribbon, fallen buttons, and even tiny pearls. Together, they mended the hem, patched the bodice, added a sash of soft pink silk. Cinderella sewed slowly, lovingly. With each stitch, she remembered her mother's hands guiding hers long ago, teaching her to thread a needle, to dream big. Outside, the wind blew through bare trees. But in the attic, there was warmth, laughter, and hope stitched into every thread. By the eve of the ball, the dress was ready. It wasn't as grand as the ones her stepsisters would wear. But it shimmered with kindness, resilience, and love, the kind of beauty no jewel could match. As she held it up to her frame and spun slowly before the mirror, the girl in the glass smiled back. Not Cinderella, not a servant, but Ella. The girl she had always been. Chapter 8, Shattered Dreams. The night of the royal ball arrived like a breathless dream. Cinderella had finished every chore. The floors gleamed, the drapes were drawn, the silver sparkled. Drizella and Anastasia were shrieking upstairs, trying to outdo each other in beauty and perfume. Lady Tremaine floated through the halls like a queen, directing the chaos with practiced grace. And in the attic, Cinderella dressed quietly. She stepped into the gown, the one she and her little friends had poured love into night after night. It fit perfectly. The pink sash caught the candlelight. The tiny pearls glowed like stars. She brushed back her hair and tied a blue ribbon around it. Her heart beat fast. When she walked down the stairs, time seemed to pause. Even Lady Tremaine blinked. Anastasia's mouth fell open. Drizella dropped her fan. "Where did you get that?" Lady Tremaine asked slowly, eyeing the dress. Cinderella kept her voice steady. "It was my mother's. I fixed it myself." For a moment, no one spoke. Then, with a sneer, Drizella hissed, "That's my sash. I lost it last week." "And those pearls?" Anastasia screeched. "They were on my old necklace." Cinderella stepped back. "No, I found them. You threw them away." But it was too late. Fury twisted Anastasia's face. She lunged forward and yanked the ribbon from Cinderella's hair. Drizella ripped at the pearls. In seconds, the gown they had so lovingly crafted was torn. "Stop!" Cinderella cried out. But they didn't. Lady Tremaine simply watched, arms folded, eyes cold. When they were done, Cinderella stood breathless, her dress ruined, hair undone, heart pounding. The soft sound of the carriage wheels outside signaled that the others were ready to leave. "Well," Lady Tremaine said at last, "I did say you could go, if you were ready. But clearly, you are not." And with that, she turned her back. Anastasia and Drizella swept past Cinderella like thunderclouds, their perfumes lingering cruelly in the air. The door closed behind them. Cinderella stood alone in the hallway, shaking. Then she ran. Up to the attic, up the creaking steps, collapsing near the window where moonlight spilled across the floor. Her hands trembled. The dress lay crumpled in her lap, threads torn, dreams unraveling. She buried her face and wept. For a long time, there was only silence, broken by the sound of her sobs, and the ticking of the old clock that now mocked her. Midnight had not yet struck, but to Cinderella, the night already felt over. Chapter 9: A Light in the Darkness. The stars above glittered with indifference as Cinderella wept by the attic window, her dreams scattered like the torn threads at her feet. She thought of everything, the laughter of her stepsisters as they rode off to the palace, the mocking silence of Lady Tremaine, and the fragile hope she had carried like a candle in a storm. It had been snuffed out so easily. The mice peeked out from behind a trunk. Gus brought a thimble of water, as if it might soothe her tears. Jack placed a tiny hand on her shoe, looking up with sad, shining eyes. "I tried," she whispered to them. "I really tried." Suddenly, a breeze stirred the curtains, not cold, but strangely warm and fragrant, like spring had entered the attic. The room glowed slightly, soft and golden, though no candle was lit. Cinderella sat up slowly. And before her, stood a woman unlike any she had ever seen. She was tall, wrapped in a cloak of silver mist and moonlight. Her hair shimmered like spun glass. In one hand, she held a staff tipped with a glowing crystal. Her eyes sparkled kindly, as though they had seen every tear and still believed in joy. "Don't be afraid," she said with a voice like wind chimes. "I've come to help." Cinderella blinked. "Who are you?" The woman smiled. "Your fairy godmother, dear." The mice gasped. Gus toppled backward in surprise. "Now," the fairy godmother said, surveying the room, "let's see what we have to work with." She waved her staff once. The tattered gown lifted into the air, spinning in a whirl of light. The fabric stitched itself, the pearls realigned, the faded color bloomed into silvery blue. Within seconds, the dress was transformed, no longer a repair, but a masterpiece of grace and light. Cinderella's breath caught. "But what good is a dress without the ride?" the fairy godmother winked. She turned to the window. "Gus, Jack, would you do the honors?" The mice nodded excitedly and led her down to the garden, where a lone pumpkin sat near the gate. With a flick of her wand and the words bibbidi-bobbidi-boo, the pumpkin burst into a golden carriage, polished and shining. 4 white mice became majestic horses. The old dog Bruno transformed into a regal footman, standing tall with a silk sash. Finally, she handed Cinderella a pair of glass slippers, gleaming, delicate, and unlike anything the world had seen. But remember, my dear, the fairy godmother warned, this magic lasts only until midnight. At the final stroke of 12, everything will return to how it was. Cinderella nodded, heart racing. Then she stepped into the carriage, shimmering like moonlight itself. As it rolled away toward the castle, Cinderella looked back once, just once, at the attic window, now empty again. She didn't know what waited at the palace. But she knew this, for the first time in a long time, the world felt full of possibility. Chapter 10, A Dance of Destinies. The palace shimmered like a jewel under the night sky. Lanterns lined the grand staircase, fountains whispered in the courtyard, and 1,000 stars seemed to gather above as if watching from heaven itself. Carriages rolled in, nobles spilled out in silks and velvet. Music floated through the air, violins, harps, flutes blending into a song of wonder. The royal ball was in full swing. But when her carriage arrived, the world seemed to still. Guards bowed. Footmen rushed to open the golden door. And out stepped a young woman in a gown of silver and starlight, wearing glass slippers that caught the moon and shattered it into light. No one recognized her. Not Lady Tremaine. Not Anastasia. Not even Drizella. They stared from the staircase in disbelief as she glided past them, head held high, face calm, eyes wide with wonder. Inside, the grand ballroom sparkled with chandeliers and candlelight. The prince stood near the dais, half smiling at the crowd, but his heart was elsewhere. The women he had met all night felt, rehearsed. Pretending. Dull. Then he saw her. Not just her beauty, but her presence. She moved like she belonged and yet looked like someone who'd walked through storms. There was something real in her eyes. Something free. Without a word, he walked straight to her. "May I have this dance?" he asked, bowing slightly. Cinderella curtsied. "I'd be honored, Your Highness." They took the floor as the music shifted, softer now, slower. Around them, the crowd faded. The room blurred. There was only the two of them. He spoke gently. "You don't seem like the others." She smiled. "Is that a good thing?" "It's the best thing," he said. They laughed. They danced. They talked, not about politics or fashion, but about childhood trees, books they loved, the feeling of waking early and hearing birds before dawn. She never said who she was, and he never asked. In those few hours, something bloomed, quietly, unexpectedly. A connection not forced, but felt. Yet, even as her heart swirled with joy, Cinderella heard a clock chime from somewhere far off. Her smile faltered. "What's wrong?" the prince asked. I have to go." "But, wait." Before he could follow, she had turned and run, faster than she ever thought she could. Down the stairs, through the courtyard, into the waiting carriage. In her haste, one glass slipper slipped from her foot and landed on the marble steps behind her. The prince reached the staircase just in time to see the carriage vanish into the night. He looked down at the slipper, delicate, perfect, still warm from her touch. He picked it up and whispered to the stars above. "Whoever you are, I will find you." Chapter 11. The Search for the Girl in Glass. The ball ended in a hushed confusion. Guests whispered among themselves, who was that mysterious girl? Where had she gone? And why had the prince stopped everything to chase her? But the prince said nothing. He held the glass slipper in his hands as though it were sacred. His heart still beat with the rhythm of the dance, and her laughter echoed in his ears. He had spoken to hundreds of women, yet only she had felt true. That night, he summoned the Grand Duke. "This girl," the prince said, "is the one I will marry." The Duke blinked. "But your highness, you do not know her name. You know nothing of her." "I know what matters," the prince replied. "And I know she wore this." He held out the slipper. "Find the girl who fits it. Search every house in the kingdom. Bring her to me." The next morning, the royal search began. Trumpets sounded. Heralds spread the message, "By royal decree, the girl who fits the glass slipper shall become the prince's bride." In every village, town, and corner of the land, noblemen arrived with velvet pillows and the delicate glass slipper. Hundreds tried it on. Some wept when it didn't fit. Others forced and shoved until the slipper nearly cracked. But the shoe fit no one. Meanwhile, Cinderella's house buzzed with panic and preparation. Lady Tremaine heard the news and her blood ran cold. A girl from their home, dancing with the prince? Could it have been? No, impossible. Still, she watched Cinderella more closely. Cinderella, for her part, said nothing. She quietly went about her chores, her heart fluttering every time the wind rustled the trees, thinking maybe, just maybe, the prince would come. Drizella and Anastasia, of course, were convinced they were the mystery girl. "I told you he loved my laugh," Drizella shrieked, tripping over her heels to practice walking. "No, he liked the way I twirled," Anastasia barked, spinning into the table and knocking over a vase. Lady Tremaine said nothing. But her eyes narrowed whenever Cinderella entered the room. And far across the land, the Grand Duke was growing tired. House after house. Foot after foot. Nothing. But he was determined to fulfill the prince's command, even if it meant reaching the last house on the edge of the kingdom. A house with creaking shutters, cracked stone steps, and a girl waiting in silence. A girl with a secret, and a matching slipper hidden beneath the floorboard. Chapter 12. The Final Door. The sun was beginning to set when the royal carriage rumbled down the path to the last house on the Grand Duke's list, a lonely, ivy-covered estate at the edge of the kingdom. Lady Tremaine saw them from the upstairs window. Her eyes widened. "Girls! The prince's men are here!" Anastasia shrieked and fell off a chair in excitement. Drizella tripped over a pile of ribbons. Lady Tremaine ignored them both and turned sharply toward the attic stairs. Cinderella was humming softly to herself, cleaning the window when the door burst open. Lady Tremaine entered like a shadow, her face tight with false calm. "They're coming," she said, "and you will stay here." She grabbed Cinderella's wrist, dragged her into the room, and locked the door with a heavy iron key. Cinderella ran to the door. Please. Just let me try the slipper. That's all I ask. But her stepmother was already gone, the sound of her heels echoing down the stairs. Downstairs, the Grand Duke entered with a footman carrying the velvet pillow. The glass slipper shimmered atop it. We are under royal command, the Duke declared. All young women must try on the slipper. Lady Tremaine smiled sweetly. But of course. Anastasia went first. She shoved her foot in, grunting, but the heel wouldn't slide in. Drizella tried next. She squeezed and pushed until her foot turned red, but no luck. The Duke sighed. Is there no one else in this house? No, Lady Tremaine said smoothly. Only my daughters. But just then, a sound broke the lie wide open. A soft creak, the sound of an attic window slowly sliding open. Cinderella, trembling but determined, climbed down the old wooden trellis, heart pounding, skirts catching on branches. The mice had brought her the hidden slipper just moments earlier. She stepped inside through the back door. Wait, she called, just as the Duke turned to leave. Lady Tremaine froze. I live here too, Cinderella said, her voice clear. The room fell silent. Lady Tremaine's face went pale. Anastasia gasped. Drizella whispered, no. The Duke blinked. Well, of course. Please, come forward. Cinderella sat down gracefully and extended her foot. The glass slipper slid on perfectly. The Grand Duke nearly wept with relief. But, wait, Cinderella said softly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the second slipper, the one the fairy godmother had left her with. I have both. Lady Tremaine sank into a chair, stunned into silence. The Grand Duke stood tall. By royal decree, you are to be brought to the palace at once. Cinderella turned once to look at her stepmother, not with hatred, but calm strength. Then she stepped into the carriage, the door closing behind her like the end of a painful chapter. Ahead, the castle glowed. And this time, she wasn't running away. She was heading home. Chapter 13, The Crown and the Heart. The royal carriage thundered across the moonlit roads, carrying more than just a girl. It carried hope, justice, and the quiet dreams of someone who had waited so long to be seen. Cinderella sat with her hands folded in her lap, the second slipper beside her. Her heart raced, not with fear, but with a strange peace. For the first time in years, she felt free. The castle gates opened. Trumpets announced her arrival. The prince stood at the top of the grand staircase, eyes locked on the carriage. His breath caught when he saw her step down. No mask. No magic. Just her. But somehow, she was even more radiant than before. They met in the center of the hall, surrounded by nobles, servants, and guards, but in that moment, it felt like only the two of them existed. You came back, the prince said softly. I didn't mean to leave, Cinderella replied. But I didn't think someone like me would be allowed to stay. He reached out, gently taking her hand. Then let me say this clearly, in front of the entire kingdom. I don't care where you came from. I care about who you are. He knelt, and from his pocket, he pulled a small velvet box. Gasps filled the room. Will you be my princess, not because of a slipper? but because you're the bravest, kindest person I've ever known? Tears welled in Cinderella's eyes. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will. The crowd erupted in applause, but she only heard the sound of her heart finally answering its call. Later, as the celebration roared through the palace, Cinderella walked through the halls with the prince beside her. He showed her the gardens, the royal library, the stables, every corner of the life she would now share. And though she wore a gown and tiara, she remained unchanged. She laughed like she used to in the attic. She spoke with kindness. She didn't forget the mice, the garden, or her late parents. She had risen, not because of magic, but because of her character. And the prince, he had chosen not a title, but a soul. Chapter 14, A New Dawn. The morning after the ball was quiet, golden, and full of promise. Cinderella awoke not to the sound of orders or chores, but to soft birdsong outside her window. The sun poured in like a blessing. Her new room wasn't grand because of its gold, though it shimmered, but because it was filled with peace. Servants greeted her with kindness. Not because she wore a crown, but because she had always treated others with grace, even when she had nothing. In the weeks that followed, Cinderella embraced her role, not just as a princess, but as a voice. She met with those who worked behind the palace walls, the maids, the cooks, the gardeners. She listened to their stories, remembered their names. She improved conditions for the poor and pushed for education for young girls in distant villages. She restored old libraries, reopened orphanages, and planted gardens where there had once been ash. And she did not forget. One quiet afternoon, she returned, not as a servant, but as herself, to her old home. Lady Tremaine and her daughters watched her from the shadows, filled with shame and confusion. But Cinderella simply said, "I don't carry hate. Only lessons. You taught me strength. You taught me patience. And I am free now." She didn't punish them, nor did she invite them back into her life. Instead, she built her own. One built on compassion. One where love wasn't a spell, it was a choice. And as the years passed, the story of the girl with the glass slipper became a legend, not just for its magic, but for its message. That even in the darkest corners, kindness can take root. That courage, humility, and grace are more powerful than any crown. And that every girl who has ever been overlooked deserves to be seen, heard, and celebrated.